By the way, all of you that responded online, we got your responses, and I appreciate you letting us know what you think. We do pay attention to you when you respond to us during the service. I get immediately brought up to date on everyone that's contacting us that are watching us online. But this is Jacob in the Torah. I did Yeshua in the Torah, which took me 2 weeks. Then I did Moses and the Torah. And this is going to be Jacob and the Torah. But I'm going to start on a trail. Most of you are used to my trails. I'm going to start this message with the trail. Because I'm talking about Jacob, who is better known as James. All right? The Greek name in the Bible is not Demetrius. The Greek name Demetrius would be translated as James. The Greek word is Jokubus, which would be translated Jacob. All right? The brother of Yeshua who wrote the book of Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to James when the Bible was translated in English to win the favor of the king, who was King James, in the year 1611. And when they translated it, it is still today called the Authorized Version. I don't know who authorized it, but it's the Authorized Version. It's the King James Bible in honor of King James, who let them translate it into English. And they wanted to stay on his good side, so they changed Jacob's name to James and called the Bible the King James. Authorized. But we try to be a little bit more accurate here. And so, at least for this teaching, I'm going to use his name. His name was Yaakov, Jacob. All right? He was one of the brothers of Yeshua, and he particularly led the first century movement of the Messianic movement, which was historically at that time called the Way. Okay? And the Way existed all the way up until the 4th century. It was known as the Way, which was a sect of Judaism. We ran into trouble at the Bar Kokhba war, and we were ostracized. But really, if you want to find out where he came from, he's introduced in Acts 15, which I actually put in there. And in Acts 15, beginning in verse 13, go ahead, Joni. Can't read that. You got to get the background out. After they finished speaking, Jacob answered. And see, what happened is they came back to what was considered the Messianic Sanhedrin. Gentiles were being reached, and they needed decisions on what they were supposed to do, because there's debate of what do you do with Gentiles who come into the kingdom? Something that those of you who have known me historically, I had the same problem. What do you do with Gentiles? If you're not used to Gentiles, it's like, what do you do with these people? And so they go back to Jerusalem to go to the leadership, which is considered a Messianic Sanhedrin. You always go back to Jerusalem. You always go to Sanhedrin. It's a group of elders that run. And so he's responding to that. He's just responding to the question, what do we do with Gentiles who come into the kingdom? Because there were Gentile believers coming into the kingdom who said, we must be circumcised, the Judaizers. The Judaizers were not Jewish, they were Romans. And they said, we all have to be circumcised. And it's one of the things that was being debated about. And he is going to lay down a verdict on the question, what do Gentiles have to do to come into the kingdom? Because there was a question, do they have to get circumcised if they come into the kingdom? And that's something that was going on in Rome. In verse 14, Simon has described how God first showed his concern in taking from the Gentiles a people for his name. Now that's going back. Simon is Kepha, is Peter. He had a vision on the rooftop. Was it the last tour? On the English bus. One of my tours went over to the house. the one before last. 2 tours ago, Spanish bus got caught at the airport, so we decided to go over to Joppa and stop in at Simon's house, the tanner, where his vision took place. And if you recall, Shimon, Kepha, Peter was told, don't call unclean what I've called clean. He went to the house of a Gentile, and the Spirit fell on them, and there was this big debate. Whoa, you went into a Gentile's house. And that's why he said how first, I'm still in verse 14, wherever you are. You're 2 verses ahead of me. Simon had described how God first showed his concern by taking it from the Gentile people for his own name. And so it's like, look, God showed us something immediately with Shimon and his vision about the unclean things. Verse 15, the words of the prophets agree. In other words, you have to have 2 witnesses, all right? Always have to have 2 witnesses to verify any truth. Simon was one witness. The other witness was the prophets. And the prophets it's explained in verse 16. You're in chapter 13. I'm in chapter 15, Joni. After this, I will return and rebuild the fallen tabernacle of David, and I will rebuild its ruins and restore it. This is a fascinating prophecy, which I'm not going to be talking about today, but pay attention to what he's saying. It's a promise of the restoration of the tabernacle of David, and the temple is still standing. The second temple is still standing when he says this. It's a deep understanding of worship, which is what the weekend's going to be about in a couple weekends when we do the School of the Theology of Worship. And it's an interesting thought, because they're talking about what to do with the Gentiles, and Jacob uses the picture where the prophets say, after this, I will return and rebuild the fallen tabernacle of David. I will rebuild its ruin, and I will... did we get there yet? No, let me find it in here. And I will restore it. In verse 17. So the rest of humanity can seek the Lord. And just in case you don't know who the rest of humanity can seek the Lord, he says, namely all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Says Adonai, who made these things. Verse 18, known from of old. And so he's drawing a picture. It's an allegorical picture. It's very deep. Most of you are used to this stuff. Look at it as an allegory. He will rebuild the fallen tabernacle of David when the temple's still standing. And the Gentiles will come into it. The Gentiles will come into it, which is a picture of David coming into it and sitting before the Ark of the Covenant when no one was allowed to sit before the Ark of the Covenant. David did it. And God was pleased. And Simon is pointing out, the prophet said the Gentiles will come in. Because in the temple, they can never get to the Ark of the Covenant because it's where the English, Kedoshah Kedoshim, the holies, the most holy, the Holy of Holies, or the most holy. Only a high priest went there once a year. But in the tabernacle of David, you had open access, which you're not supposed to have. It's against the Torah. And the prophet said, look, not only will he rebuild it, the Gentiles will come into it. And then with that picture, he brings a summation of, in case you don't understand the decision I make in verse 19, therefore, I judge not to trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God. They said, well, what do we do with these Gentiles? Do they have to be circumcised or not? And he says, look, I judge not to trouble. Why should we add to what they have to do to come into the kingdom when they're turning to God? We should rejoice that they're turning to God. I'm not going to judge what else they could do. Verse 20, but to write to them the basics. Abstain from contamination from idols. An idol is anything that is not God that you turn to. Just don't have any other gods, in other words. You got to turn from all your idols. No more sexual immorality. Think of places that we talked about, like Corinth, all right? And from what is strangled and from blood. Because the soul is in the blood, and you don't ingest the blood of anything. Because you don't want to ingest the soul of anything. So let's keep this real basic. What do they have to do to come in the kingdom? They've got to learn the basics. No idol worship, no sexual immorality, nothing that is strangled, and don't eat any blood. And then he explains in the next verse, verse 21, for Moses from ancient generations has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read in the synagogue every Shabbat. Now, some people translate that proves you don't have to keep the Torah, and I think Jacob is saying they'll pick up on it. It's read every week. It'd be centuries before there was a Christian church. And so every Shabbat, somebody reads from the Torah. They'll learn. They'll pick it up. Start with the basics. No idols. No immoral sex. Not strangled animals. Don't take blood. Just keep yourself separate. Because they can learn Torah, because Torah is taught and read in every congregation all over the world. And now we're going to jump to the next chapter 21, down to verse 18. It says, Paul went in with us to Jacob, and all the elders were present. These are this sorting out relationships. Remember, Paul, when he left Jerusalem, was an Orthodox Pharisee who went out to persecute the way. And now he comes back in an apostolic mantle, having become the apostle to the Gentiles. And he's got to sort things out with the leadership that existed before him. The rest of the rest of the apostles. Verse 19, after greeting them, he reported to them in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his service. Verse 20. And when they heard, they began glorifying God. You see, brother, how many myriads among the Jewish people have believed, and they're all zealous for the Torah. And so the way, which was the beginning of the kingdom under the Messiah, are zealous for the Torah. In verse 21, they have been told about you that you teach all the Jewish people among the Gentiles, here's the rumor, to forsake Moses telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to the customs. Here's the issue. There's rumors. They're saying that you're teaching all the Jewish people out there in the nations they shouldn't circumcise. A lot of debates early over circumcision, which, remember, predates the Torah. It ties to the call of Moses. In your teaching, they shouldn't pay attention to Moses. They shouldn't circumcise. They shouldn't walk according to our customs. And verse 22, what should be done there? And you see there's an equality that is recognized. The other original apostles recognize Paul's apostolic mantle, and they're talking to each other as peers. And you need to see that. That's a big deal when somebody talks to you as a peer and not an overlord. And remember, that didn't exist until after the establishment of the Christian church with Constantine, that there's a person over you. In the way, everybody is a part of the kingdom, and we work together. What can be done then? It's a question. What do you think we should do here? What can we do? No doubt the rest of the way that's there in Jerusalem, because remember, Paul wasn't from Jerusalem. He's back after having left. Now he's come back as an apostle. Verse 23. So do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow upon themselves. Here's what we can do. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. What vow? The only vow you can take upon yourself is the Nazirite vow. So you know they took a Nazirite vow on themselves because they've taken a vow upon themselves. If I see that's a free will, I choose to take a Nazirite vow. What does that mean? I'm not going to cut my hair. I'm not going to partake of any of the fruit of the vine. And I'm going to take, and because it's voluntary, I'm going to take a Nazirite vow for 6 months. I'm going to take a Nazirite vow for 3 months. I'm going to take a Nazirite vow for 2 years, 3 years. In the case of the English judge, Samson, he had a Nazirite vow from birth, right? And wasn't allowed to cut his hair. That's why he got in trouble when his hair got cut. It's a Nazirite vow. We have 4 men who have taken a vow to themselves. And I want you to understand, this is the way. This is the messianic movement of the first century. And the way they were zealous for the Torah. And some of the believers were taking a Nazirite vow. I choose to take a Nazirite vow. It's not a foreign thing to them. Verse 24, take them and purify yourself along with them, pay their expenses so that they may shave their head, so they can cut their hair. You take these 4 that have made a Nazirite vow. And if you read carefully the book of Acts, Paul had taken a Nazirite vow when he was out on his journeys. And when it ends, you have to go to the temple in Jerusalem and do the appropriate cleansing and the appropriate sacrifices. But he wasn't able to do that because he couldn't get back. Now, these 4 believers had taken a Nazirite vow, and they needed to cleanse themselves and do a sequence of sacrifices required for a Nazirite vow. So you go with these other 4 believers and pay their expenses so they may shave their head. That way you will realize there is nothing to the things that have been told about you, but you yourself walk in orderly manner, keeping the Torah. You need to show you live by the Torah, you believe in the Torah, you walk by the Torah, and you can go with these other Jewish believers, and you can go in. You have to purify yourself because you're going to the temple, and you're going to give a sin offering. You're going to give a guilt offering. You're going to give you're going to repent of what. Just read it in the Bible. I don't want to go through that whole thing because I don't know what I'm teaching. But you have to understand there's a sequence of sacrifice you have to do. Why? Because you gave up on joy. You didn't partake of wine. You didn't drink any wine. God offers you joy, and you say, I won't have any joy during this time. I'm going to humble myself. I'm going to let my hair grow and just do these things. And it's not that it's a bad thing to do, but it's a guilt thing to do because now you have to bring a sacrifice because you didn't enjoy life. You went through a time when you purposely humbled yourself before God. But the end result is if you're going to keep the Torah, well, then bring a sacrifice because you did that. Although it's a good thing, you still owe a sacrifice. Okay? And they're working this out with Paul. And they've already decided what to do with Gentiles. And they've said, by the way, in case you haven't heard in verse 25, as for Gentiles who believed, however, we have written by letter what we decided from them to abstain from what food offered to idols and from blood and from what is strangles and from immorality. Here's what you need to do to prove you're still Torah observant by those who have heard the rumors, which is part of our covenant agreement, right? No rumors. But people aren't careful. Rumor about one another. I heard this, I heard that. Let's clarify this. You live in obedience to the Torah. As for the Gentiles, we already wrote what they have to do. We already wrote what they have to do. And so when you look at the relationship of Jacob to the Torah, Jacob is leading the way. He is dealing with Paul. He verifies that Paul is living according to the way, Torah observant, even though he's out among the Gentiles. That proves he's not teaching that Jews are no longer under the Torah because everybody keeps the Torah. And the Gentiles, they'll pick it up. They don't have to do it all at once. In Jacob chapter 1, go to the letter he wrote. I've been in the book of Acts because it shows the relationship of Jacob and Paul as peers, as apostles. He's recognized as an apostle. And he is respected, and everybody is zealous for the Torah. All the Jewish believers of the way are zealous for Torah. In the letter to Jacob, which is in a Christian Bible called James in honor of King James, all right, verse 19. Know this, my dear children and sisters. Let every person be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Verse 20, for human anger doesn't produce righteousness but God. Verse 21, so put away all moral filth and excess of evil and receive with humility the implanted word. Okay, this is a letter that is written in an allegorical format. The implanted word. What's that mean? The word is in me. It's a part of me. It's not something I read. It's something that's a part of me, which is able to save your souls. So I'm going to walk and abstain from moral filth. He doesn't have to say that means don't be sexually immoral. Just abstain from moral filth and excess of evil and receive with humility the implanted word which is able to save your souls. And the implanted word which you're going to receive is the Torah, which is read every week. Does not negate the prophets, does not negate the writings, and does not negate, frankly, the letters of Paul, if you pay attention to what the Bible says. But the Bible that we had, that everybody had, was the Torah. Because throughout history, everybody had the Torah. They didn't have necessarily the whole Tanakh. They didn't have all the prophets. They didn't have all the writings. It's whatever your congregation could afford. When I was over talking to the Lamba in southeast Zambia, a Kohanim tribe, they had left just after the Babylonian captivity, and the only book they had with them was the Torah. And the only thing they knew was the Torah. They had no idea what a kippah was for, what a talit was for, or why anyone would be a rabbi. And for those of you that were here, one of the questions the elder had as I sat with him, who are you as a rabbi? What can you as a rabbi tell me as a priest? And I had to be able to handle that by recognizing who they were. They had no concept of rabbinic Judaism. None. It did not exist. We think this stuff has been around forever. It has not. It has not. Because they had the implanted word. They came over in 3 ships, by the way, and the ship that was carrying the Torah was lost at sea. And so they had to go with what they remembered, and that was at the end of Babylonian captivity. That was a few centuries ago. And still, all they know is the Torah. So somebody like me is like, and it's an honest question. It's the elder of the tribe. What do you as a rabbi have to say to me as a priest? And I answered, and he said, why do you wear that thing on your head? Because I was wearing it. And no one else in the village wore these things. Why? Because that's past Babylonian captivity. They only knew the Judaism of the Second Temple period. They built the Second Temple, or the First Temple, excuse me. And they built the Second Temple because we talked about that. I won't get into that history. There's a history there. You Gentiles, put away moral filth, excess of evil, with humility, the implanted word. Listen to the words of God as he gives them to you, largely in the Torah, not because it's the whole Bible, it's just that's the only book that came in its entirety. And if you can only buy one scroll, you always bought the Torah. If you're wealthy, maybe you could buy Isaiah. Maybe you could buy Zechariah. Maybe you could buy Yonah. Maybe you could buy another book. But, they're all handwritten, ghastly expensive. And it's implanted in your soul. And what do you do when you're reading the Bible and it uses a term? What are you supposed to do? Find out where it's used somewhere else, right? Put it in perspective. These things don't happen in a vacuum. Let me just make a small change here. And it says, no, let's on your note, I actually jumped. Go to Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31. Behold, the days are coming. It's a declaration of Adonai when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Verse 31. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day I took them out to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they broke my covenant, though I was a husband unto them. It is a declaration of Adonai. But verse 32, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my soul within them, yes, yet I will write it on their heart. I will be their God, there will be people, which is why Paul was able to write the implanted word in your heart. It's a fulfillment of God's introduction to the new covenant. He's going to put the Torah not on tablets of stone. Tablets of stone are unchangeable. He's going to write it on our heart. And so that's why he said, receive with humility the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. What's the implanted word? It's God writing the Torah on your heart. That's the implanted word. I want you to see that. People say the Torah, that's the Old Testament. We live by the New Testament. I said, yeah, the New Testament is 21 centuries old. The Old Testament is 22 centuries old. It's all old. But it's only one Bible because God doesn't change. He says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. So God never changes. If he changes, then he can't judge us. Because if he changes, so I don't know, you kept changing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Anyway, I need to keep going. Verse 33, still in Jeremiah. No longer we each teach his brother, saying, No Adonai, for they will know me from his declaration of Adonai, for I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more. That's interesting because that's verse 34, up there, and it's not. Verse 34, thus says Adonai, who gives the sun as light by day, fixed order of the moon and stars by night, stirs up the sea so its waves were Adonai Tzvaot is his name. Adonai Tzvaot, the warrior title of God, translated host, Lord of hosts, right? Remember, this is the prophet Jeremiah, and he's saying, I'm divorcing you. Here's the bill of divorcement. Get out of town, you lose the house. That's why anytime he uses the name Adonai Tzvaot, that's the warrior title of God, it's never a good time. Never a good time when he's using that particular name for himself. Verse 35, only if this fixed order departs from before me, its declaration then also might Israel's offspring cease from being a nation for me for all time. It's a covenant that he has made with the people of Israel. If you've ever been taught, this is the church age, you've been taught dispensational theology, which was created by the Ryrie Study Bible a couple hundred years ago. And that's where all Western eschatology comes from. Eschatology is a study of the end time. It's prophetic. It's eschatological, which means it's future and all that stuff. You've been taught something that says the church replaced Israel. The theological term is it nomenclature? I think it's nomenclature. But it's a replacement theology. The church has replaced Israel. According to God, if the sun, the moon, and the stars stop shining, then God will give up on Israel. Will always be a nation before him. Verse 36, that says Adonai, only if heaven above can be measured and your foundations of the earth searched out beneath, also I'll cast off the offspring of Israel for what they have done. It's a declaration of Adonai. No matter how screwed up we are as a people, God said, I will keep you as my unique people because I chose you for all time. All right? And so I want you to see that Jacob is drawing from this particular book when he says, look, it's the implanted word on your heart. That's what you live by. Go back to that letter, Jacob chapter 1 down to verse 22, which is where we are if you're actually following me in the book of Jacob, which is the book of James in Christianity. Verse 22, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deluding yourselves. One of the challenges is I'm not here to impart knowledge. I'm here to awaken you to the grandeur and greatness of God so you can draw closer to God. I have no desire to teach us to become Torah observant because we are not Torah observant. We are a saved people by grace and faith, right? Go back a couple teachings that was last week. Why did he give us the Torah? Because he loves us and he wants to show a redeemed people how to live a life where you get blessings and not cursings. So don't, be doers of the word, not hearers only. Like, I can learn all this. I can memorize this 613. And he draws a picture, verse 23. Anyone who's a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks his natural face in a mirror. Verse 24, for once he looks to himself and goes away, he immediately forgets what sort of person he is. It's like you look in a mirror, it doesn't do you any good. Verse 25, but the one who looks intently into the perfect Torah, the Torah that gives freedom and not legalism. The Torah that gives freedom and continues in it and not becoming a hearer forget, but a doer acts, he shall be blessed. In the perfect Torah, if you don't know what the perfect Torah is, it's a Torah that gives freedom. Freedom, because you can teach the Torah that brings legalism, and that is death. But you need to accept the Torah. The perfect Torah is freedom. Verse 26. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, his religion is futile. Most congregations, I don't care if they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, most of them teach religion. Most of them teach religion. God hates religion. It's futile. Verse 27, a picture. Pure and undefiled religion before God our Father is this. You care for the orphans and the widows in distress, and you keep oneself unstained by the world. Unstained by the world. The concept of holy. Be holy, for I am holy. That doesn't mean you're not without sin. Everybody sins and falls short of the glory of God. The concept of holy is to be totally separated. I don't know if I did this in the blog or an outline of another message I'm going to give someday. We are called to be holy. How does he do that? Fine, we live in Yeshua. Yeshua is holy. What does that mean? I mean, he was totally separated from the world. Even though he was in the world, he was not of the world. And if we're in Messiah Yeshua, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. Totally separated. Don't become unstained by the world. That's pure and defiled religion. Do things before God. Take care of widows or for in their stress. Just if people need help, be helpful to people. Make something better in the world. Everybody is called to ministry. Nobody is called. There are no spectators in the kingdom of God. Everybody that's in the kingdom of God is called to be ministering to people. Love God, love others, make disciples. You know, it's the perfect Torah is the Torah that gives freedom. That's the perfect Torah. I am not Torah observant. I do not seek to be Torah observant. I do not want to teach you to be Torah observant. I want you to accept the Torah that gives you freedom, not that brings death because it becomes legalistic to you. There are people that are associated with congregation that are all debating how we should behave and how we're failing because we're not teaching people to be Torah observant. And I say, I am teaching you to be Torah observant. Proper religion is doing good things for other people and be unstained by the world, and you walk being led by the Torah that's on your heart. You can't go back to the tablets of stone. It'll always bring legalism. Legalism brings death. Jacob chapter 2. Just walking through this letter, which is called James by the church in honor of King James. It's not like it's a terrible thing to call him James. And it made King James happy. At that point in time, you needed King James backing. I don't need King James backing. I'll still call him Jacob. Verse 8, if, however, you fulfill the royal law, it's a high thing. It's one of the things I did when I met the queen, the high queen in Zambia. And I had to just focus because my inclination, because I've been with other queens, is to call me Your Highness. But that was an affront to call her Your Highness. I had to remember, I have to say Your Majesty. Your Majesty. And, you know, because you have to give, you render to Caesar things that are Caesar. When I appear before a queen, I gave her, I brought a gift, which is appropriate. I brought a gift, and I said, may I approach you, Your Majesty? And I knelt down and helped her to like this. And we were in her living room, which she's not allowed to meet anybody in her house. We have to meet in the palace. We bumped into each other on the road. And she connected with me. God does odd things sometimes. You know, I'm driving down this back road in Zambia, and we pull over. Well, I'm with my bodyguards, and we stop behind this other big black SUV. And I thought, why are we stopping? It's the Queen. We must greet her. The Queen had heard we're in the area, so she sat there on the road and waited for us to catch up with her. And I went over and I stood back as we talked, and I was introduced. And she said, you're Rabbi Judah. I've heard of you. I said, yes, ma'am. Yes, Your Majesty. And when she approached, I approached her, but I stood because you don't be an American. And she put out her hand. When she put out her hand, I took her hand and bowed. Proper etiquette. Proper etiquette. Because you have to do this. It's the royal law. It's something that's high and magnificent. According to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. Because if you can put up with one another, you can walk with God. Because what really screws up the kingdom is the people of the kingdom. King's pretty easy to get along with. But the people of the kingdom are weird. The Bible calls us a peculiar people. A peculiar people. Verse 9, but if you show favoritism, you're committing sin and are convicted by the Torah as transgressors. Do you understand that? He's not against the Torah. He's saying this is the Torah. It's what's inside of you and how you behave, how you react. Yeshua taught on the Sermon on the Mount that to hate someone is to commit murder. If you hate someone, it's murder. You can't hate anybody. Anyway, verse 10, for whoever keeps the whole Torah, which means you're walking in Torah observant, but stumbles at one part, you're guilty of all. Which is why I'm not going to try to be Torah observant. I don't want to make that commitment before God because I will fail miserably. So if you want to keep the Torah and become Torah observant, if you mess up one thing, you're guilty of everything. Verse 11. For the one who says, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you're a transgressor of the Torah. All right? He's talking about people who are flirting with the idea, are we supposed to keep the Torah or not? Because it was a debate. How Torah observant are you supposed to be? It's a debate that happens in this congregation with some of our members, and they're unhappy because we're not keeping the Torah or we're too Torah observant. We have both camps in here associated with it. None of you, of course. It's people that are not here today. And he said, you want to be Torah observant? Fine. But if you mess up one point, you're guilty of them all. Because the one who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. So if you do not commit adultery, but you commit murder, you're guilty. All right? Verse 12. So speak and act like those who are judged according to the Torah that gives freedom. He's not saying don't walk by the Torah. You walk by the Torah that gives freedom. It's the one that's on your hearts. And you don't have to keep the Torah. You get to keep the Torah. There's a huge difference between somebody who has to keep the Torah and somebody who gets to keep the Torah. All right? And that's the Torah that gives freedom. There's no legalism there because legalism brings death. It's a spiritual application of the Torah. That's what he's writing. How do you spiritually apply the Torah? It's all precepts that frees, that liberates us from the constraints of sinful habits and behaviors. I don't know how to walk as a believer. I'm a believer because of grace. I am saved by grace. by faith. It all comes from faith, right? I taught that last week. I'm saved by faith, and it's the grace of God, the unmerited favor of God. Now, how do I walk this out? I have to understand I will be judged by those who keep the Torah if I think I need to keep the Torah to be righteous. No, I get to keep the Torah, and that frees me. That liberates us. It brings to freedom, so I can get rid of my sinful habits and behaviors. Verse 13, for judgment is merciless to the one who does not show mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Don't judge one another. You don't keep the Torah. Well, that's not what you're supposed to do. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Verse 14, this is an incredible picture. What good is it, brothers and sisters, someone has faith but does not have works? Can such faith keep him? I have faith. I have faith. I'm going to sit here and have faith because I'm saved by an act of faith, which is the grace of God because of faith. Now I'm saved. I'm in the kingdom. I'm kingdom, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stay home. Why am I going to stay home? Because if I try to come into any congregation, you try to find a perfect congregation, it's ruined because you came into it. And it's people of the kingdom that make you crazy. I just stay home with the Holy Spirit and I'll honor God. And that way I won't have to struggle with all you crazy, peculiar people. Now, Jacob correctly connects faith and works together. If you can't have faith without works. This implies, if you'll let me say this, people who make a simple profession of faith without continuing on to good works are only fooling themselves, and I doubt their salvation. Essentially, he's saying that obedience to the moral and ethical components of the Torah is the only valid indication of salvation. How do you know I'm saved? Because I keep the underlying concepts of the precepts of the Torah. I get to do that. Your confession of religious affiliation by words alone is not sufficient. I belong to Beth Messiah. I'm one of Rabbi Judah's kids, that doesn't get you in the kingdom. You're not going to appear before God and say, hey, I was with Rabbi Judah. It's like big deal. Do you understand? You're responsible for your own walk. Verse 15, if a brother and sister is naked and lacks food, and one says, go and shalom, keep warm and be well fed, and do not give them what the body needs, what good is that? What good is that? Verse 17, so also faith that does not have works is dead in itself. These people said, I said a prayer once, therefore I am saved for eternity. Eternal salvation, that's what it calls? Eternal salvation. Once you have your salvation, can you lose it? It's like, well, that's the problem. Salvation is not the end. It's the beginning. It's a free gift. Work it out with fear and trembling. I got saved in 1976. I received my salvation. I could have sat there and stayed there, but then there's no faith. I'm not walking it out. Faith without works is dead in itself. Verse 18, another picture. If someone say, you have faith, I have works, and I'll say, show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. I have faith. Somebody says, I have faith. And I said, well, you show me your faith without doing anything, and I'll show you my faith by doing things I do. You have to be doing things. It's a moving kingdom. Blessings, doctors. Verse 19, you believe that God is one. You do well. Demons believe and shudder. People think if I believe in Yeshua or Jesus, I am saved. I said, Satan, Hasatan, the accuser, believes in God. He believes Jesus is the Messiah. He's not saved because he believes that. You got to do more than believe. Verse 20, but do you want to know, you empty person, that faith without, do you want to know, you empty person? What's an empty person? You have faith without works, you're dead. Verse 21, wasn't Abraham, our father, proved righteous by the works he offered up when he offered up Isaac on his son? So what I want you to see, because these are all allegorical pictures, and he's giving the summation of the picture in verse 22, that faith worked together with his works, and by his works his faith was made complete. Because after this, God said, now I know you have faith. like he didn't know before. All right, verse 23, as the scripture was fulfilled, and he said, Abraham believed God, it was credited to him as righteous, he was called God's friend. He was called God's friend because he's willing to offer up his son Isaac. Did he have to offer up Isaac to be a friend of God? No, but he had to do the works that God called him to because he was a friend of God. And if he was going to walk through the kingdom as one of God's people, he had to do whatever God said, whether it made sense or not. And his faith was made complete because when he did what God wanted him to do, God showed him the greatness of God in that. Verse 24, you see that a man is proved righteous. You see that a man is proved righteous by his works, not by faith alone. Abraham was accredited with righteousness only after he tried to sacrifice his son. I have to do what God tells me to do because if I don't have any works, it's not by faith alone. It's not enough to say, I believe. I believe. I believe. Satan believes. Verse 25, and likewise, wasn't Rahab the prostitute proved righteous by works when she welcomed the messengers and set their others away? That's the you want to get that for me? You're holding my phone. That's okay. It might be for me. Verse 26, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. The body without the spirit is dead. I taught somebody in the Ringling room. I drew a picture on a napkin, or I used, well, was that here? I used plates, 2, 3 plates. Was that here I did that, or was that somebody else I did? I talk to people all the time. I explained the body and the soul, the 3, must not have been here. No one's saying, yes, that was me. Somewhere I taught that. The body without spirit is dead. You know what a zombie is? The walking dead. It's somebody walking around out there without the Spirit of God, and they are dead. In the garden, the day you eat this, you're going to die. What happens? You lose your relationship with God. And you have a body, you have a soul, but you have no spirit. And now you try to plug the hole. You plug the hole with alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, anything. I got to plug this hole. I got to plug this hole to plug this hole. It was made for this presence of God, the Spirit of God. The body without spirit is dead. Faith without works is dead. Chapter 3, just walking through this book. This is Jacob and the Torah. Verse 13, who among you is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, let him show his deeds in gentleness and wisdom. Show people what you believe by the way you walk through this world, by what you do. Verse 14, if you have bitter jealousy and ambition in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Verse 15, this is not the wisdom comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Let's not judge one another. And I'll tell you how that works. If you're here in this congregation, you're part of this congregation, and you know the other people in this congregation, you're willing to put up with them, not because you all believe the same, because you don't. And there are people who are not here today because they're offended by me. I'll use me. I won't talk about you. They're offended by me because I'm not doing it the way they want it done, and they're judging me. It's like, look, I'm doing the best I can. And they'll judge, I'll use Stephen. I like to pick on Stephen because I'm the only one that really knows what he's doing for. He's doing a tremendous amount of work. It's just nobody knows what he's doing. And so Stephen offends people. And Stephen is this, Stephen is that, Stephen is something else. It's like, why are you judging Stephen? You don't have a clue what he's doing. You don't have a clue who he is. If you haven't taken time to get to know him. This is diverse congregation. Over 16 nations in our membership. This is about as diverse as you can get. This is a kingdom center. This is not a congregation where everybody's the same. I mean, we have Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Buddhists from China. Miss Young's in the ringing room. I assume she was a Buddhist. But what's the main god in her section of China? It is Buddha. Yeah, I know. I know her. Believe she lived there anyway. But, it's wisdom that comes down from above is earthly, not unspiritual and demonic. Verse 14, for where there is jealousy and selfish ambition exists, there is disorder and evil, every evil practice. I celebrate the diversity of this congregation. You know, I have to let people know if you want to worship God in Chinese or Russian or Spanish or Arabic, Hebrew, you worship God in the language you grew up in. God could hear it all. Verse 17, but the wisdom above is pure. First, it's pure. Then it's peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, not hypocritical. Verse 18, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in shalom by those who make shalom. If you're a part of God's kingdom, your fruit of righteousness is shown by your peace and the fact that you're trying to make peace with others. Which takes away all the rumors and all the chattering and all the, I don't believe the way you believe and you're wrong, you're falling short of my standards. Chapter 4, verse 10, humble yourselves in the sight of Adonai, he will raise you up, which is, by the way, a quote from the Psalms. Verse 11, do not speak evil against one another, brethren. The one who speaks against a brother or judges speaks against the Torah and judges the Torah. If you speak against somebody, you're speaking against the Torah, you judge the Torah. But if you judge the Torah, you're not a doer of Torah, you're a judge of the Torah. And you know what? There is a judge of the Torah. There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and destroy. You want to be the judge of the Torah? Look, Messiah is the judge of the Torah. He's the one that gave the Torah. Verse 12, there's only one lawgiver. Is that where I am? The one who's able to save and destroy. But who you would judge is your neighbor. Like Yeshua, which is like 2 teachings away, Jacob reinforces the finer points of the Mosaic Torah. And among his greatest concerns is the exhibition of love displayed between one person and another. Yeshua said, by this all men will know you're my disciples, because you love each other. And you love each other, particularly in this congregation, which is different than most congregations because of the diversity of people. You know, that exhibition is a fulfillment of the law or the Torah, and that's given in Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17. You are not to hate your brother in your heart. Instead, you are to firmly rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. In other words, if I see something that I disagree with, Michaeline, I see something in your life that I disagree with, this is what I perceive you are doing. Unless God gives me a direct word for Michaeline, I said, I perceive you're doing something wrong here, and I'm concerned that my perception is you're doing something wrong. Because I want to help her, not judge her. Do you understand that? Because if I judge somebody, I'm sinning. I sin because I see something in you and I judge it. Oh, you're wrong. Now, I get myself in trouble. Verse 18, you're not to take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. You love Adonai as yourself. I am Adonai, right? I am Adonai, which is like, this is the end of this particular letter of Jacob that deals in this, the concept that I want you to grasp. He was not anti-Torah. He was not anti-grace, anti-faith. He was anti-legalism. He was anti-license. Legalism is you must keep the Torah. License is I don't have to keep the Torah. I can choose a day of worship any day of the week I want. I don't have to do it on Shabbat. I can celebrate. I don't know what this time of year is out there. What's Christianity doing nowadays? Is there anything coming up in Christianity? I don't know. What's the next big thing in Christianity? Christmas. I don't have to worry about Sukkot. I will worry about Christmas. It's like, wait a minute. You know. But I'm telling you, I don't judge anybody that has a Christmas tree. For all I know, that Christmas tree reminds them of Messiah. And somebody who's who's wrapped up in centuries of tradition before Christianity was invented or created or whatever they did with it, I have to be careful I still don't do things. I mean, when I'm standing before a priest who the last time he knew about Judaism was the Second Temple period, okay, when Ezra was rebuilding the temple, that's when that group of priesthood split off. And if you read the book, you see where they split off. And they ended up in Africa. I could show you the whole they did that, which means they long before Yavne, long before Rabbinic Judaism, long before there were rabbis. And then well-meaning people go into their, especially, frankly, it's the Messianic movement that's messy. It's called Messianic because we're a messy movement. Somebody from the Messianic movement, a rabbi will go to them and say, I am the rabbi, and I'm here to straighten you out. Here's what you got to do. Got to wear a kippah. You got to wear a talit. You got to do all this stuff. And they're saying, what are you, crazy? Not everybody, the Jewish community is ancient. We have a lot of baggage, but you know what? I'm saved by faith and grace. And Jacob said, you got the Torah, but Torah is the Torah that gives you freedom, not the Torah that binds you up. So do you have to keep the Shabbat to be saved? No, you do not. You do not have to keep the Shabbat to be saved because you're saved by faith, and it's the grace of God. But if you want to be blessed, you keep the Shabbat because that brings blessing and life into your life. Not eternal life, blessing and life. And if you don't keep the Torah, you bring death and a curse in your life. It's that simple. It's that simple. The true Torah of God gives me freedom. And the freedom that I have, I know how to behave because God gave me the Torah. And that's what Jacob thought about the Torah. Next week, we'll talk about what Paul thought about the Torah. He wrote a lot more letters than Jacob did. And we'll walk that down. Be blessed, everybody. Shabbat shalom. Let me just say this. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you, be gracious unto you, lift up his countenance upon you, and grant you his peace. In the name of Yeshua, the Prince of Peace, be blessed, all of you, with all the blessings of God in your life. May you be set free of all that shackles you. And may you truly become a disciple of our King, Yeshua the Messiah. Be blessed, everybody. Shabbat shalom.